So, if a state uses just overwhelming military force to, starve a marginalized community, or if it systematically disappears dissidents in the middle of the night. Wait, no, I shouldn't use pauses like that. Let me restart that. If a state uses overwhelming military force to starve a marginalized community, or if it systematically disappears dissidents in the middle of the night, is a peaceful protest an act of nobility, or is it just an act of suicide?
Right. That's the core of it.
Yeah, and today we have this massive stack of political ethics papers, philosophical frameworks, and theories of resistance that force us to look directly at, honestly, the darkest corners of human survival.
Yeah, we are absolutely bringing you into one of the most enduring and frankly agonizing questions in political theory today.
Exactly, and I want to pose this directly to you, the person listening to this right now. If peaceful resistance is systematically ignored, right? If it is intentionally crushed, or if it is answered with just lethal state violence, is violent resistance ever justified?
It is a question that just totally strips away the luxury of, theoretical utopian ethics.
Oh, completely.
Because the source material we are examining today, it doesn't deal with standard political friction.
Right. We aren't talking about policy disagreements over taxes.
No, not at all. We are analyzing notes that emerge from environments defined by, well, severe extremity.
Like really extreme baseline conditions.
Exactly. We are talking about populations enduring hostile military occupation.
Yeah.
We are looking at the moral calculus of those living under absolute dictatorships, colonial rule, systemic racial terror.
Situations where the state itself is the danger.
Right. Environments where the state utilizes mass imprisonment, systemic torture, and forced disappearances just as everyday administrative tools.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because right out of the gate, these sources hit us with two massive, completely competing moral realities.
They really do.
On one side of the ledger, the texts are definitive about the nature of violence. It is a universally corrupting force.
Universe.
Yeah, it shatters communities, it unleashes chaos that escapes all strategic control, and it possesses this gravity that pulls even the most righteous liberation movements into the mud.
It drags them right down.
But then the counterpole is just as strong, right? If you demand absolute, unwavering nonviolence from a group of people who are being actively physically oppressed.
Which is a huge demand.
Huge. You are essentially demanding that they submit forever to the organized violence coming from above.
And that is the defining tension of this entire field of study.
Right.
To insist on pacifism when the boot is actively crushing someone's neck. I mean,
yeah,
that might feel like a triumph of moral purity for the outside observer.
Oh, for sure. For someone sitting comfortably in a democracy.
Exactly. But for the oppressed, it can mean a guarantee of endless suffering and eventual erasure.
Which perfectly establishes our mission for this deep dive.
Yes, it does.
Because our goal today isn't to figure out what justice demands in a perfectly functioning democracy. That's easy.
Right. The sources aren't about that.
No. We are here to figure out what human beings are permitted to do when justice is completely denied to them by a monopoly on physical force.
We are dissecting the anatomy of survival and resistance. But before we dive into the actual mechanisms of these arguments, I think we need to establish a very firm boundary for our discussion today.
Oh, absolutely. This is critical.
The frameworks we're pulling from touch on really intense, often harrowing political realities.
Yeah.
So our role here is strictly analytical. We are not taking a stance.
Right.
We are not endorsing any political viewpoints, historical movements, or, contemporary ideologies.
We're just acting as impartial guides through the ethical architecture provided in this specific source material.
Precisely. We are just unpacking the logic just as the philosophers and theorists have laid it out for you.
But, before we can even begin to evaluate the morality of those arguments, we run into this massive linguistic barrier.
The definition problem.
Yes, the definition problem. We have to define what political violence actually is, because the term is just, it's heavily abused.
It really is.
In everyday discourse, it functions as this massive catch-all phrase that essentially loses its analytical utility.
And what's fascinating here is how the language we use often obscures the actual reality of the actions taking place.
Totally.
So to ground us, the source material provides a strict definition. It says political violence is the use of physical force, injury, destruction, or killing specifically for political ends.
And that political ends component, that does all the heavy lifting there.
Yes, it does.
Because we aren't discussing random criminality. We aren't talking about a bar fight.
Right. We are talking about force utilized with a structural intent.
Like trying to change the system itself.
Exactly. The intent to overthrow a regime, to dislodge a foreign occupation, to defend a marginalized demographic, or to force a massive shift in state policy.
But even with that parameter, the text groups a wildly vast range of actions under this umbrella of political violence.
A huge range.
Yeah. We are talking about the sabotage of physical infrastructure.
Like disabling a power grid.
Right, or destroying an empty railway line.
Yeah.
But we were also talking about armed, localized self-defense against state police.
Which is very different.
Very. And then we're looking at guerrilla warfare, targeted assassination of political leaders, widespread terrorism against civilian populations, mass uprisings, and full-scale revolutionary war.
And that sprawling categorization is exactly why we must approach this with precision.
Yeah.
Because while all of those actions fit the technical definition of deploying force for a political end, they operate in completely different moral universes.
I mean, lumping all of these actions together under one vague word is just intellectually lazy.
It really flattens the ethical landscape.
It totally flattens it. Think about it this way. It's like comparing a surgical scalpel used for self-defense to a sledgehammer swung blindfolded in a crowded room.
That's a great analogy.
Right. Because there is a canyon-sized moral gap between a movement launching an armed defense against a battalion of soldiers carrying out mass repression and a group deliberately attacking innocent civilians in a marketplace to spread terror.
And what's fascinating here is how the failure to make that distinction serves certain political narratives.
500%.
Because when we use the blanket term violence to describe both the scalpel and the sledgehammer, we strip away the context.
We lose the intent.
We lose the intent, and critically, we lose the target.
Yeah, we make the structural sabotage and the mass casualty events sound like the exact same moral failure.
And the source argues forcefully that this specific distinction is the foundation of any serious ethical inquiry into resistance.
You have to separate them.
You have to. Not all violence is morally identical. A targeted attack on a military supply depot enforcing an illegal occupation requires a completely different ethical accounting than planting a bomb in a civilian center. We cannot answer the question of justification at the level of a single vague word. We have to look at the specific mechanism of force being deployed.
So if we accept that, right, that there's a profound difference between targeted structural resistance and indiscriminate terror, we still run into this deep, almost biological resistance we have to justifying political violence of any kind.
Yes, that innate revulsion.
Yeah, even when the cause is undeniably just, there is an inherent revulsion to the use of force.
Yeah.
Why is the case against violence so massive, even in the context of liberation?
Well, the source begins its answer by anchoring us in the undeniable tangibility of violence.
The physical reality of it.
Exactly. The texts insist that we never allow political violence to remain an abstract academic concept.
Like it's not a thought experiment.
No, it is never a sterile move on a chessboard. It is a physical reality. It means human bodies are broken.
Yeah.
It means a pervasive, suffocating fear permeates a community. It means families are permanently shattered.
The physical reality of it is absolute. And the text points out that the destruction echoes forward in time.
It doesn't just stop when the fighting stops.
Right. Violence mathematically guarantees that trauma is passed on to the next generation.
Always.
It hardens the opposition, ensuring that whatever baseline empathy might have existed between conflicting groups is completely erased. It basically functions as an engine for new, unending cycles of revenge.
Which leads right into one of the most vital warnings in the source material, which is the illusion of control.
Oh, I love this part.
It's so critical. There is a pervasive myth, and it's often sanitized by historical hindsight or romanticized in media.
Like in movies, right?
Exactly, like in action movies. There's this myth that violence can be deployed as a precise surgical instrument.
You can just use it, get what you want, and turn it off.
Right. There is an assumption that a movement can initiate a perfectly contained strike, achieve the political objective, and just cease operations with minimal collateral damage.
But the reality, at least according to the ethics notes we are reviewing, is that violence inherently exceeds intention.
Always.
It is wildly contagious. You might initiate the use of force with a very narrow, localized goal, but the moment that threshold is crossed, the violence takes on an autonomous life.
It spreads horizontally.
Yes, and it escalates vertically. It dictates the terms of the conflict in ways the initiators could never have modeled or controlled.
It creates a fundamentally unstable environment. And And this raises the most critical internal question for any resistance movement.
Okay, what happens to them?
Right. What happens to the architecture of a genuinely righteous movement when it decides to integrate violent means into its operations?
The sources describe what is essentially a process of internal rot.
That's a good way to put it.
Like, it changes the DNA of the movement.
Yeah.
So how does that mechanism actually work? How does the adoption of violence reshape the people using it?
Well, it happens through the logistical necessities of sustained combat.
Logistical necessities.
Yeah. Because if a resistance movement engages in violent struggle against a more powerful state apparatus, it requires absolute secrecy to survive.
You can't just have an open town hall meeting.
No, you cannot operate openly, but that requirement for secrecy naturally and inevitably breeds an authoritarian discipline within the ranks of the movement.
Because you can't have horizontal democratic debate about tactical strikes when the state police are actively hunting you.
Exactly. The movement shifts from a collaborative political body to a vertical military hierarchy.
Right.
Furthermore, to maintain the psychological will to inflict lethal harm, the movement must systematically encourage the dehumanization of its opponents.
You have to hate them to fight them.
Right. You cannot effectively fight an enemy you deeply empathize with.
But, and this is the terrifying part, the dehumanization doesn't just stay directed at the enemy soldiers, does it? It bleeds inward.
It always bleeds inward. The movement begins to exhibit deep paranoia and contempt for dissent within its own ranks.
So if you disagree, you're the enemy.
Basically, anyone who questions the efficacy or morality of the violent tactics is no longer viewed as a colleague with a differing opinion.
Right. They're viewed as a liability.
Or a sympathizer, or a traitor. Slowly, the organization develops a sprawling internal logic that justifies necessary cruelty, not just against the oppressor, but against its own people to maintain discipline.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the tragedy is staggering.
It really is.
A movement that originally formed to fight against authoritarian domination, to fight for human rights and collective freedom, is forced by its own violent tactics to reproduce that exact same authoritarian domination within its own ranks.
The resistors are reshaped into a mirror image of the oppressor.
They become morally unrecognizable from their original intent.
The means devour the ends.
The means devour the ends.
Wow, it is the central paradox of violent resistance and the deepest casualty of this moral rot. The absolute moral boundary that the source draws is the inevitable harm to civilians.
Because it can't be controlled.
Right. Because violence is fundamentally uncontrollable and contagious, it refuses to stay cleanly contained between armed combatants.
It spills out into the general population.
Right.
The sources note that ordinary workers, civil servants, and bystanders inevitably become targets.
The collateral damage.
Yeah, and the psychological concept of an enemy population becomes incredibly blurred. Suddenly, anyone who isn't actively fighting alongside the resistance is viewed as complicit with the oppressive regime.
And the text highlights this as the ultimate failure point for a movement's legitimacy.
Their whole foundation crumbles.
Yes. The foundational ethical principle of any just struggle is that those who are not actively participating in the harm the noncombatants must never be made targets.
Right.
Yet the chaotic, escalating nature of political violence means they almost inevitably are.
Okay, I want to push back on the entire premise of violent liberation right here, based on what these sources are saying.
Let's hear it.
If a resistance movement claims its sole purpose is to fight for the people, to secure their freedom and physical safety, but in practice, it ends up deliberately targeting or recklessly endangering the very non-participants it claims to represent.
Which happens a lot.
Right. Hasn't it completely voided its own moral mandate? Like, it has contradicted its entire reason for existing.
Well, many ethicists in the source material agree with you completely.
Okay.
They draw a hard line, arguing that the moment a movement embraces tactics that systematically harm civilians, they forfeit any moral high ground.
Regardless of the past.
Exactly. Regardless of how historically just their original grievance was, the rot is complete.
Okay, so the case against violence is overwhelming.
It's a very strong case.
It is inherently corrupting, uncontrollable, and devastating to the soul of a movement. But this forces a pivot in our analysis.
Right.
Because if the costs are so catastrophically high, why do human beings ever turn to it?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah. To understand that, the sources argue we cannot judge these movements in a sterile vacuum. We have to examine the actual suffocating environment they are operating within.
We have to look at the structural context of oppression. And most illuminating concept the text introduces here is the deconstruction of what it calls the myth of the peaceful status quo.
I love this part. This is a crucial reframing, because we are conditioned to think of peace simply as the absence of active riots or open warfare in the streets.
If nobody is shooting, it's peace.
Right. But the source utterly dismantles that definition. It asks us to look at the mechanisms by which an unjust system actually maintains its daily power.
And those mechanisms are brutal.
They really are. According to the text, oppressive regimes maintain control through the constant threat of militarized police,
Right.
the expansive use of prisons, systemic torture, the forced seizure of ancestral land, engineered starvation, and armed exclusion from political participation.
Yeah. And when you look at that list, you realize that none of those mechanisms are peaceful.
No.
They are deeply, structurally violent.
Here's where it gets really interesting for you listening. Oppression isn't maintained by harsh rhetoric or biased legislation on paper.
It's not just bad laws.
No, it is enforced every single day by physical force. The daily status quo in an oppressive regime is already a state of high, constant violence against the marginalized population.
Which brings us to a concept the text refers to as the one-sided argument.
One-sided argument.
Yes. This is where the profound moral trouble of demanding absolute nonviolence from an oppressed group really comes into focus.
Okay.
Because if a regime is maintaining its absolute power through torture, starvation, and arbitrary execution, and you demand that the oppressed population must never, under any circumstances, use physical force to resist.
You are functionally saying, let the organized violence remain entirely one-sided.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You are asking the victims to absorb the physical violence indefinitely without ever raising a hand to stop the machinery that is destroying them.
Which feels so wrong.
Ethically, that is deeply troubling. If a state apparatus rules entirely by physical force, denying all political avenues for change, by what moral logic should the oppressed be the only ones completely denied the use of forceful means to protect themselves?
It's wild because we universally grant the right of lethal self-defense to the individual in domestic law.
All the time.
Right. If someone breaks into your home and attempts to inflict lethal harm on your family, the moral and legal frameworks across the globe basically agree that you're justified in using force to stop the attack.
Absolutely.
But the friction happens when the source tries to scale that exact same right to a collective political body facing state aggression.
That is the pivotal transition. Why doesn't that intuition scale?
Right, why not?
If an entire community is under direct violent assault from a state military, why is their collective organized self-defense suddenly categorized as an immoral act of political violence while the individual defending their home is celebrated?
The text seems to navigate this by separating the intent behind the force.
Yes.
Like, it distinguishes between aggressive violence and defensive violence.
That is a crucial structural distinction in this ethical framework. Aggressive violence is deployed for domination, conquest, territorial expansion, or revenge.
It's trying to take something.
Right. Defensive violence is deployed purely for protection, survival, and the cessation of an ongoing physical attack.
It's trying to stop something.
Exactly. The moral weight of an action shifts dramatically when its sole, verifiable purpose is to stop an immediate threat to life.
But even when presented with that logic of collective self-defense, the immediate counterargument is always, well, look at history. Nonviolent resistance works. They should just utilize civil disobedience.
That's always the response.
Yeah, and we absolutely celebrate the monumental successes of nonviolent resistance. But the source forces us to look at the grim, terrifying reality of what happens when nonviolence is actively weaponized as a trap by the state.
And this is the ultimate grueling challenge to absolute pacifism.
It really is.
The text asks us to analyze contexts where peaceful protest is not met with dialogue.
Or even arrests.
Right, not arrests or even water cannons. We are asked to consider regimes where peaceful strikes are met with outright calculated massacres.
Solely mowed down.
Yes, we are talking about environments characterized by total censorship, where a massive civil disobedience campaign isn't even reported to the wider public.
So no one even knows they're protesting.
Exactly. Regimes where dissidents who peacefully hand out pamphlets are simply disappeared into black sites.
In those specific extreme environments, the sources argue that nonviolence might be an incredibly noble, spiritually pure choice for the individual.
Spiritually.
But strategically, it is completely crushed. It has no mechanism for political success if the oppressor possesses zero moral limits and controls all flow of information.
This raises a profoundly disturbing question for you to ponder.
Yeah, think about this.
The critics of absolute pacifism within these texts ask, are human beings morally required to remain nonviolent even when the oppressor treats their peaceful resistance like a localized infection to be exterminated?
Wow.
Is there a moral duty for a marginalized group to march peacefully into a machine gun?
It's a haunting proposition,
Yeah.
and it forces the acknowledgement that in the face of absolute, unyielding brutality where all avenues of peaceful redress are violently closed, some form of defensive political violence might be the only logical recourse for collective survival.
It might be.
But, and this is a monumental caveat in the text, just because collective defensive violence can sometimes be morally argued in these extreme vacuums, it doesn't grant a blank check on the battlefield.
Not at all.
No. We have to draw a strict, impenetrable line regarding who is being targeted by this defensive force.
Yes. This brings us to the hard boundary separating legitimate, albeit tragic, resistance from terrorism.
The ultimate distinction.
Right. Because even if a cause is profoundly just, even if the survival of a people is at stake, the specific targets of the resistance permanently determine its moral validity.
So let's break down the taxonomy of targets the text provides.
Let's do it.
First, we have what they classify as oppressive agents. This includes armed defense against actual state soldiers, physical resistance against militarized police who are actively carrying out repression,
Right.
or the sabotage of the physical machinery being used to destroying a surveillance network, disabling a military supply train, or compromising a state armory.
And the text acknowledges that targeting these oppressive agents still carries immense moral weight.
You're still using force.
It is still the application of lethal force in many cases. But fundamentally, it occupies a different conceptual space from terrorism because the targets are the active, participating mechanisms of the oppression itself.
Right.
The force is directed at the source of the harm.
Which establishes the stark contrast with the second category. The source provides a very strict, unyielding definition of terrorism.
And what is that?
It says terrorism is the deliberate, intentional targeting of civilians and non-combatants to create widespread fear and exert political pressure on a government or society.
This is the critical, uncrossable boundary. It is the intentional targeting of people who are not enforcing the oppression, who are not armed, who are not participating in the state's violence.
People who are just going about their daily lives.
Exactly.
The ethical failure of terrorism, according to these notes, runs incredibly deep. It isn't just about the scale of the violence. It is about the fundamental view of humanity it requires.
Yes, the philosophical failure.
Right. Terrorism treats human beings, innocent civilians, merely as tools. It uses their deaths, their broken bodies, entirely as leverage to send a message or extract a political concession.
It is a profound violation of Kantian ethics.
Ah, Kant.
Yeah. The foundational principle that a human being must always be treated as an end in themselves and never merely as a means to an end.
And terrorism completely ignores that.
Absolutely. Terrorism explicitly uses the innocent as a mechanism to achieve an outcome.
You see this justification attempted in historical debates all the time, right?
Yeah.
Where a vanguard movement will defend horrific, indiscriminate acts by arguing, well, we had no other way. The state military was too strong. We had to shock the wider society into recognizing our suffering. We had to bring the war to their doorsteps.
The desperation argument.
Yeah, but analyzing these ethical frameworks, that rationale holds zero weight.
No.
The text is definitive. Intentionally attacking civilians crosses a line that no political end, no matter how righteous, desperate, or historically validated the underlying grievance is, can ever justify.
Never.
So, drawing directly from the sources, we can establish this firm parameter. While limited, defensive political violence directed at the apparatus of oppression might be justifiable under extreme conditions of survival.
Right. Might be.
Terrorism is absolutely never justified.
It operates as a hard limit in the ethical architecture. The moment a resistance movement crosses that line and intentionally targets non-combatants, they have entirely abandoned the moral justification of their struggle.
They lose it completely.
Yes. They have become agents of arbitrary terror.
So, we have explored the dark, suffocating necessity of defensive violence, and we've drawn the absolute line at terrorism.
We have.
But before any listener assumes this deep dive is validating armed resistance, the sources force a major strategic pivot.
A really important one.
Even if a movement manages to keep its violence strictly targeted at oppressive agents, avoiding terrorism entirely, we have to look at the alternative. Why is nonviolence, despite the arguments for collective self-defense, still presented as the vastly superior strategic and moral mechanism?
Because the text doesn't just treat nonviolence as a spiritual ideal or a moral luxury.
Right.
It presents it as a highly pragmatic, asymmetric strategic advantage. And the first major advantage it highlights is the preservation of the movement's moral clarity.
This circles back to our earlier discussion about how violence inherently corrupts the soul of an organization.
Yes, the internal rot.
Right. Nonviolent resistance acts as a structural shield against that internal authoritarian rot.
It protects them from themselves.
It keeps the movement's moral center completely visible, not just to the outside world, but to its own members. It boldly declares, we are refusing this systemic injustice, but we absolutely refuse to become agents of terror ourselves in the process of dismantling it.
The means always shape the movements.
Always.
By utilizing nonviolent means, the movement is actively practicing the exact kind of society it wants to build. It insists on maintaining its humanity in the face of the state's inhumanity.
But beyond the preservation of moral high ground, there's a massive practical limitation to armed struggle that the source identifies.
And what is that?
Not everyone can join a violent resistance.
Oh, right, the demographics of it.
Exactly. It requires a specific demographic: physical fitness, youth, access to weaponry, specialized training, and a psychological willingness to inflict lethal harm.
Which is a very small pool of people.
It naturally and immediately excludes the vast majority of any population: the elderly, children, people with disabilities, or individuals who simply possess a deep moral objection to taking a human life.
Which means an armed resistance is almost always relegated to a small vanguard group.
Right.
It is inherently exclusive, and because it is a small, secretive vanguard, it often becomes disconnected from the very people it claims to be fighting for.
But look at the mechanics of nonviolent resistance. Anyone can join a consumer boycott.
Absolutely.
Anyone can participate in a widespread labor strike. Anyone can engage in slowdowns, civil disobedience, non-cooperation with state administration, or mass public witness.
It's radically inclusive.
The source argues that because nonviolent tactics are accessible to the entire demographic spectrum, the resistance becomes immensely wider.
Right.
It becomes deeply democratic. And because it involves the whole of society withdrawing its consent to be governed, it is far more structurally transformative than a localized gunfight.
This raises an incredibly important strategic question, one that the sources urge us to consider when analyzing asymmetric conflict.
Okay, what is it?
What does the oppressor actually want the resistance to do?
Oh man, this point completely reframed how I view state repression.
Oppressive regimes, particularly heavily militarized, well-funded state apparatuses, often structurally want the resistance to turn violent.
Because violence is the native language of the oppressor.
Yes.
It is the one arena where they possess overwhelming, insurmountable advantages in funding, logistics, and firepower.
Precisely. If the resistance initiates violence, it immediately hands the oppressive regime the ultimate public relations victory and the perfect administrative excuse.
Look how dangerous they are.
Exactly. The state can point to the violent vanguard and broadcast to the international community, see? We told you these people were dangerous insurgents. This is why our brutal repression and martial law are absolutely necessary for public safety. True security requires us to escalate our use of force.
It just validates their whole thing.
It validates their entire architecture of control.
So synthesizing the text's argument here, nonviolence isn't just morally cleaner for the internal soul of the movement. It is politically and strategically far wiser.
Much wiser.
It is a form of asymmetric political jujitsu.
I like that. Jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, it completely strips the oppressor of their favorite, most effective narrative. It forces the heavily armed state to use physical violence against entirely peaceful people.
Which looks terrible for them.
Horrible. And when a state is forced to arrest or assault unarmed citizens simply sitting in a public square, it exposes the regime's inherent brutality to the world, often shattering its internal and international legitimacy.
It uses the opponent's violent weight and lack of moral restraint against them, destabilizing the regime's authority in ways a small armed insurgency never could.
But, and this is a big, but let's follow the timeline to its darkest conclusion.
Okay.
Let's say a movement has exhausted all of that. They've tried the labor strikes, the boycotts, the peaceful protests, the mass non-cooperation.
They've done everything right.
And the state has responded, not with arrests, but with mass executions, scorched earth policies, and systemic disappearances.
The extreme scenario again.
Right. If a movement facing actual extermination does finally cross that line into defensive violence, how do we ethically evaluate it?
Well, the source doesn't just leave us in an ambiguous gray area.
Thankfully.
It provides a very strict, narrow framework borrowed heavily from the historical just war tradition to evaluate if the resistance can claim any moral justification.
And it is vital that we spend some real time unpacking these 5 specific conditions for you, because the text is uncompromising.
Extremely uncompromising.
These are not loose guidelines or suggestions. They are absolute concurrent requirements. If even one of these conditions is not met, the moral justification for the violence collapses entirely.
So let's walk through the architecture of this framework. Condition number 1 is just cause.
Just cause. The source dictates that the injustice being resisted must be exceptionally grave.
Exceptionally.
This framework cannot be invoked for a mere political disagreement, an unjust tax policy, electoral fraud, or a controversial legislative decision.
Right. It's not for everyday politics.
No. It must be a response to severe, systemic oppression, active ethnic cleansing, structural domination, or lethal physical violence against a population. The threshold for just cause is set incredibly high to prevent the casual authorization of force.
Okay, assuming the cause meets that grave threshold, we move to condition 2, which is last resort.
Last resort. This condition requires that every conceivable, peaceful, and less harmful alternative must have been genuinely attempted and thoroughly exhausted.
Genuinely attempted.
Or, as the text nuances it, peaceful avenues must be physically blocked by the state or so clearly, demonstrably futile in the current circumstances that attempting them is tantamount to collective suicide.
You can't just skip to violence.
You cannot jump to armed resistance as a first, second, or third option. It must be the final desperate recourse when all other doors have been violently barricaded.
It truly has to be the final option available for physical survival. That is logical. But condition 3 is where I think the practical application of this framework encounters massive friction.
Oh, this one is tough.
Condition 3 is proportionality. The text dictates that the force used by the resistance must not exceed what the situation morally warrants.
It demands a continuous, rigorous ethical calculation.
Which is so hard to do.
Right. Balancing the physical harm and societal chaos inflicted by the resistance's violence against the potential good achieved by stopping the state's oppression.
But how do you realistically measure proportionality when you are an underground movement fighting a superpower or a heavily militarized dictatorship?
You really can't.
It sounds so clean, almost mathematical on paper, but in the muddy, chaotic reality of a struggle, it feels impossible to calculate.
Seriously, if a state security apparatus is actively torturing dissidents in black sites, what is the proportional violent response?
Right.
Destroying the black site, assassinating the director of state security. It seems almost impossible to weigh those metrics in the heat of an existential conflict.
You're hitting on the core vulnerability of the theory right there. It is arguably the most difficult condition to assess in real time. The text doesn't pretend to offer a mathematical formula. Instead, it offers proportionality as a severe moral restraint.
Like a mental check.
Right. It acts as a necessary check against the concept of total war. It demands that the resistance doesn't adopt a nihilistic, by any means necessary mentality.
No matter what.
Even if the cause is impeccably just, blowing up a vital city reservoir to weaken the state's control, thereby causing a mass civilian drought, would egregiously violate proportionality.
The harm vastly outweighs the tactical gain.
Exactly. It forces the resistance leadership to constantly, agonizingly weigh the human cost of their actions against the necessity of their goals.
That constant restraint is crucial to maintaining humanity, which leads directly into condition 4, which we've touched on, but it's codified here.
Yeah.
Discrimination.
This is the anti-terrorism clause.
Yes. Discrimination requires a sharp, deliberate, and constant tactical effort to separate state combatants from civilian non-combatants.
You have to separate them.
The resistance must actively, at all times, avoid harming civilians. If a specific weapon or tactic cannot discriminate between an oppressive state agent and an innocent bystander, like a car bomb in a busy intersection, that tactic is instantly morally illegitimate, according to this framework.
And finally, condition 5, reasonable hope.
Reasonable hope. This condition is profoundly tragic, but ethically necessary. The source dictates that launching a violent campaign, which is mathematically certain only to produce mass suffering and brutal state reprisal, with absolutely no serious strategic chance of actually ending the injustice, is impossible to morally defend.
Basically, leaders cannot lead a marginalized people into a suicidal slaughter just to make a symbolic, historical point.
No matter how brave it looks.
Right. If the violent resistance has zero strategic chance of success and will only result in the state's annihilation of the oppressed community, it fails the ethical test.
Because the moral weight of the guaranteed death and the horrific state reprisals against the community outweighs the symbolic value of the heroic resistance.
Exactly. These 5 conditions, just cause, last resort, proportionality, discrimination, and reasonable hope, they present an incredibly demanding, almost insurmountable ethical hurdle.
And the text reminds us of a vital takeaway regarding this entire framework.
What's that?
Fulfilling all 5 of these conditions does not suddenly make the violence clean, good, or righteous.
Right.
It simply marks the incredibly narrow, fragile, agonizing space where violence might be morally arguable.
Barely arguable.
It is the absolute bare minimum required for a movement not to be immediately condemned as illegitimate by the ethical community.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most existential warning embedded in the source material.
This part is so dark.
It really is. Even if you thread that impossibly tight needle, let's say a movement actually manages to meet all 5 of those strict conditions.
A perfect scenario.
Right. They are fighting a purely defensive struggle as a last resort against a lethal state, maintaining strict proportionality and discrimination with a reasonable hope of survival. Even then, in that perfectly justified scenario, the text warns of a final, deepest risk to the very soul of the movement.
It is the pervasive danger of becoming what you fight.
Yes.
Even when violence begins purely defensively,
Yeah.
as a reluctant necessity. The text warns that over time, the sustained daily use of force slowly mutates the psychology of the movement.
It rewires their brains.
The noble, localized goal of physical protection slowly curdles into a sprawling desire for revenge.
The structural need to remove the oppressor from power turns into a dark desire for purification, a desire to entirely wipe out the enemy demographic.
Yeah, and the movement begins to build a permanent internal culture of force. Violence stops being viewed as a temporary, tragic necessity required for survival.
And it becomes what?
It slowly becomes the primary, default way the group interacts with the world and resolves internal disputes.
The source discusses the profound danger of a resistance movement finding its core identity through enemy hatred.
I mean, we've seen this historically.
Oh, repeatedly.
Yeah.
Once a group defines itself entirely by its hatred of the oppressor, rather than its love for its own people or its vision for a peaceful future, the resistance has crossed a psychological point of no return.
They're gone.
It begins to unconsciously mirror the exact same logic of domination, fear, and coercive control that it originally rose up to oppose.
It is the ultimate tragic irony of armed struggle. A generation fights a bloody, desperate war to liberate their people, only to look in the mirror decades later and realize they are wearing the administrative face of their oppressor.
This realization shifts the entire focus of the ethical debate we've been having. The ultimate question, according to the conclusion of these texts, is never merely, was the original historical cause just?
Right.
We have to ask a much deeper, more unsettling question about the human result. What kind of human beings are being formed by the daily application of these violent means?
Because if the strategic means require you to permanently abandon your empathy, your moral restraint, and your fundamental respect for human life, then the movement has failed, regardless of the military or political outcome.
It's a total failure of the soul.
A movement can absolutely win a structural victory. They can successfully overthrow the regime, seize the capital, rewrite the Constitution, and take absolute power, but completely lose morally if violence has become their deepest, most fluent language.
So what does this all mean for us as we process this? We have journeyed through an incredibly dense, morally fraught landscape today.
We really have.
We've looked at the invisible horrors of unchecked state oppression, the profoundly corrupting nature of violent resistance, the strict Kantian boundaries defining terrorism, the asymmetric strategic genius of nonviolence, and the grueling criteria of the just war framework.
So the source material provides a synthesized, deeply nuanced answer to the unbearable question we posed at the beginning. Is violence ever justified in political resistance?
And in general, the texts conclude that violence is inherently universally morally dangerous.
Universally.
It is deeply corrupting, its variables are uncontrollable, and its human costs are always catastrophic.
Yeah.
Because of this reality, organized nonviolent resistance is almost always the morally and strategically preferable path because it allows a movement to actively resist massive structural injustice without internally reproducing the very logic of domination and fear that they are fighting to dismantle.
But, and this is the crucial agonizing caveat for those actually living in extreme conditions,
This is key.
the text acknowledges that it may be too simplistic, too academically privileged, and too disconnected from the bloody reality of human history to declare that defensive force is never justified.
It's just not realistic.
In situations defined by severe, lethal oppression, hostile military occupation, or direct existential violent repression,
Ah.
especially in environments where all peaceful avenues are either totally unavailable or violently exterminated by the state, some highly specific, deeply restrained forms of defensive political violence may be morally justifiable in principle.
But that justification is razor thin.
Oh, it is incredibly thin.
It is narrow, it is precarious, and it is heavily burdened by those 5 strict conditions of just resistance.
It is never, under any circumstances, a blank check for brutality.
Which brings us to the core thesis statement, the ultimate takeaway from all these notes and philosophical theories.
And I really want you listening to chew on this for a second.
It is a profound, sobering thought that demands reflection. A historically just cause does not make the application of violence pure.
Right.
Violence and resistance may sometimes be a tragic necessity for collective survival, but it is never, ever moral innocence. At best, it may make it the least unjust option in an entirely intolerable nightmare situation.
That specific phrase, tragic necessity, it perfectly captures the immense ethical weight of the decision. It implies an action taken in deep sorrow and reluctance, not in triumph or glorification.
We started this deep dive talking about the impossible friction of this topic. When human beings are pushed to the absolute breaking point by unjust power, the moral landscape doesn't give us clean, easy answer.
It doesn't give us clear skies.
It gives us agonizing, deeply compromised choices between endless submission and moral corruption.
And as we close this analysis, the source material leaves us with a framework to view the physical struggles of the past and present. But if we extrapolate these ethical theories into our immediate future, we are left with one final, haunting thought that the original philosophers couldn't have anticipated.
And this is where it gets really modern.
We've spent this entire time analyzing physical resistance against physical oppression, soldiers, prisons, police.
Tangible things.
Right. But as modern regimes increasingly utilize digital architecture to control populations,
Oh, wow.
as states begin to rely on mass algorithmic surveillance, biometric tracking, and the digital restriction of resources, rather than deploying physical soldiers in the streets.
That's chilling.
What does defensive violence even look like when your oppressor is a line of code?
I mean, how do you even fight that?
How do you maintain proportionality and discrimination when resisting an algorithm designed to silently, peacefully erase your community's ability to exist? That is the new ethical frontier we're walking into.